increase productivity and maintain environmental health while meeting food demands over the next 30 years. Mike leads one of the research themes in this flagship, and that flagship's called Landscape Systems and Trends. This flagship observes and predicts trends across agricultural and forestry landscapes and seeks to understand the interconnection with the wider economy and environment. The theme also studies the interactions between natural resources, how we use them, and the health and productivity across the whole landscape and from farm to the consumer. It relies on innovation in information and communication to gain impact in farm communities, relevant industries, and the policies and actions of various levels of government. He has a long-standing personal research interest in spatial soil science and its application to agriculture and forest production, environment protection, and system approaches to complex problems, and has led a major multidisciplinary natural resource assessment activities for over 20 years. He says he retains capacity to use the Northcote key in the field and remembers detailed discussions on its strengths and usefulness with Ray Isbell in various soil kits. He is a fellow and honorary life member of the Australian Institute of Agricultural Science and Technology and a board member of the International Soil Conservation Organisation. And he recently co-chaired the organising committee of the World Soils Congress. Over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Richard. And thanks, Richard and Annie, for inviting me to do this. Clearly, I'm too young to have remembered Keith. To have been when Keith was around. In fact, in 1984, when he retired, I was wandering around coal mines in central Queensland at the time. Nonetheless, Keith's work has suffused my career throughout, still does. And it's things like the key and the atlas and the approaches that were used remain influential in what I do and what many of my colleagues are currently doing, my colleagues around the country that work in soil science. And that's what I'm going to use as my key for this talk today. So if you like, I'm going to use Keith's legacy as my starting point for a talk to bring you up to speed with what we're doing to answer the questions that the country asked, the nation asked with pathology. When I looked, prior to this, looked through some of the things that Keith had written, something I hadn't read before was a series of lectures that he gave here, which were published in a book, in which he talked about what was important about the key, what were the things that he was trying to achieve. And he said he had 4 criteria: objectivity, coherence, comprehensiveness, generality. Yes, that applies to the key. For me, that applies to soil information more generally. So what I'm going to do is use those and test those about the pathways that we've taken with soil information in this country in recent times. So when Keith talked about soil information, and he did, he said it meant soil sites, soil landscapes, soil maps, soil classification. Now we would probably add data in itself and metadata, other measurements that weren't around at the time, types of measurements that weren't around at the time, the samples themselves, the samples that exist in our archives that we can come back to, and more importantly, a whole range of covariates, ways of understanding our landscape that weren't available to us in the 80s. And if you like, that's the colour. And the colour will keep coming through as we go through this. Those of us have worked in soil information over that time, and I have worked in soil information since about 1977, 78. There has been a period of significant change. There has been a period of major evolution. There have been periods of revolution. It has been in many ways extraordinarily frustrating as well. One of the interesting things about soil information is that it endures. Maps that we did a very long time ago and that we recapture become useful again. And now that's one reason why each part of the Northcote legacy is still being used. And it's one reason why when we do a cost-benefit analysis for land resource assessment, soil survey, soil information, we always find these remarkable benefit-cost ratios. And that's essentially because we reuse the information many, many times. There is the frustration, though, is that we're very slow to renew. Because of that reuse, and sometimes use beyond its capability, we continue to make use of, for example, small-scale mapping, for example, the Atlas, in ways in which we shouldn't, or ways in which we really should have more and better information to do that. The Atlas remains, though, one of our really core tools. When in Queensland we run a refresher training course by the Society, excuse me, and a few times I've done the lecture in soil geography and soil classification. And where do you go for a map which tells you where the calcareosols in the world, where the vertisols are? It's the Atlas. So I'm going to go back to those words that Keith had: objectivity, coherence, comprehensiveness, generality, and I will add one other term, one other criteria, which is utility, the usefulness of the information in the way that people actually use it, to describe the paths that we've been going on since Keith. First of all, are the questions that we ask still the same? Essentially, we have tended to focus over the years on natural resource management and agriculture. We are interested in the ways in which the information we use allows us to adapt to the variable situation in which most people who manage land in this country find themselves. Have we developed the right sort of information to allow that to happen? At the National Soils Conference in Palmerston North a few years ago, prior to the final setting, we did a bit of a brainstorm and thought about all of the uses to which soil information should now be put. If you ask a room full of soil scientists what soil information should be used for, they'll come up with a very long list, which we did. There's almost nothing that soil information isn't useful for if you ask soil scientists. However, a couple of interesting things about it. One is that there has been a change in emphasis and in use over that time, from a need to understand inventory and land allocation through to more interest in things like biodiscovery, ecosystem health and all the rest of it. But there's a real back to the future thing too. So some of the issues that we were dealing with after the war around needing to know what's there, making sure that we allocate our land appropriately and use it wisely and produce enough food are suddenly and again becoming major uses for the soil information that we are doing. So in some ways, the questions are the same. There have been changes in emphases. We have been more interested in environmental protection. We don't fund it the way we used to. There are no base funded dollars to do this. They have to be funded in other ways. There has been a stronger influence on what happens in big national programs, the National Heritage Trust, National Action Plan, Salinity Water Quality, etc., and so on, caring for our country. There's been a focus towards groups, working with groups, cropping groups. Last week, or the week before, I was with the Birchip Cropping Group in Victoria, and the power of the group to use tools that the individual can't was remarkable. It used to be government-led. It's more increasingly industry or community-led. So last night I was at the Soil Science Society OGM in Brisbane, where we were given a lecture by a consultant. There were 40 or 50 members present, and of those, the majority worked for private companies, worked for environmental consulting firms, for mining companies, for power utilities. 20 years ago, that wasn't the case. 10 years ago, that wasn't the case. We tended to, in the search for generality, which I think is still important, we tried to develop systematic programs which collected all of the information that you needed to know about our landscapes. Increasingly, we're driven by single-issue drivers. And a lot of the work that those consultants that were in that room last night do As they go out into the landscape, they answer one question, they collect the data for that one question, and then they come back. And we have moved away from single disciplines, and most of us now call ourselves integrators of some form or another. If we don't, we may not get the jobs we want. Now, generality, one of those criteria, it's the audience, the people who use our information usually don't know that they want it. What they tend to do, so any particular person wants to use the information that is pertinent to their needs, but of course there are many of them. So for us, generality remains an important thing. We just need to then use it and apply it in an appropriate way. And the other thing that hasn't changed but is getting more intense is the need to use our information to solve complex, sometimes contradictory, ambivalent, ambiguous, difficult processes. And the future that we're looking at over the next 20 or 30 years promises to be more complex. Climate-constrained world, resource-constrained world. The things that we can do with soil information remain. It provides a way of visualising what's happening across our landscape, what's happening in terms of the material, of the biogeochemical processes, the things which drive our biodiversity, things that drive our production and drive our environment. It visualises where it is, tells where you are in terms of other things. So when you get people asking sorts of questions like, what's the current status of things, what's the trend, what can I do next, then from soil information they should be able to get maps, models and predictions, something that tells them about the scale of actions and outcomes. But they ask questions like, where is the issue worst, where is it most urgent, where should I invest to change things? Then they need to be able to look across the whole of the landscape. That's what we give them. They should be able to get from us detailed analysis in key areas and to be able to extract from those key areas. And looking forward, how do people know what they're doing? Are they achieving it? What have they missed? Where are they going to go next? This is where we need to be able to provide them with this monitoring capability, change over time. They're the things that people expect to answer the questions that soil information is supposed to be there for us. All right, so what do we need? How do we get there? How are we going? What needs to be done next? Over the last 15 years probably, in the National Committee on Soil and Terrain within CSIRO, across the community of source people in this country, we have developed a vision about what a national soil information system should be, and it usually has those sorts of things. I've expressed it now again in terms of Keith's criteria. We have to have an information system which is made up of our maps, our sites, our models, our archives, which is objective, so the quality is obvious, it's measured, it's transparent. You know what the uncertainty of our statements are. It has to work from the local to the national so that the things meld together in a way in which people can understand it. They talk to each other. It needs to cover the entire continent and the islands. And it has to have that generality which we've already talked about. And fundamentally, the other side of generality, when it comes down to the individual and they're using the information, it has to be simple and effective to use, regardless of the complexity of the underlying information. Now, we're not anywhere near there. Many of the things, though, that Keith started us off on are heading in that direction. And these are some of those pathways that we've been following in recent times. Now, I'm not going to talk through all of these. I'm going to take you through a couple of major examples of these. Many of you know we've gone from the Northcote Key to the Australian Soil Classification. I'm not going to talk about that for any length of time. There have been many talks given on that. I will talk about the development of the Australian Soil Resource Information System and the thinking that went through that. I will talk about this move from air photo interpretation-based soil survey, which evolved after the war, into what we now call digital soil mapping. And I will talk about how the Australian Soil Resource Information System, digital soil mapping, and this development of the Australian Soil and Landscape Grid, the current activity that we're involved in, connect to each other and all part of this need for the soil information system that we need. Oh, well, I make the comment here that we need a national monitoring system for our major activities. I'm not going to talk about it for long, except to say that we don't really have it, and it's hard to see where it's going to come from. And we are beginning to see a fusion between data and models, and I'll start to talk about that. And in the end, I will talk about apps. I'll move quickly on. The Northcote Key used to coexist. Those of us who did soil survey before the Australian soil classification coexisted with about 3 or 4 others. So typically when you did a site, you did a Northcote Key, you did a Great Soil Group, you did a soil taxonomy, you did a range of others. And to some extent, the Australian soil classification has moved us on from there, so that we have a system based on Australian soil data, which has been developed as a national collaborative activity and is now generally strongly accepted. It was a rocky time in the early days. Okay, let's talk about the Australian Soil Resource Information System. When I give talks in the US, which I occasionally do, where they have what they call the National Cooperative Soil Survey, I start off by saying that in Australia we have the National Uncooperative Soil Survey. Not by design, but because of that reason. Now, it beggars belief for many of us that we still have in this country different rail gauges in each of the states, and that we continue doing that well after federation. We are doing exactly the same in soil information. Still, now that's good. It gives local relevance, gives a relatively narrow focus, but you end up with that sort of thing. Incomplete and scattered coverage. We have individualistic approaches to survey methodology. We manage our information differently, different regimes, different licensing standards, different sharing standards. The native formats of the soil point spatial databases are incompatible. You need something else to move them together and talk to each other. That's what you get. Well, we've known that for a long time. We've actually been working on this for some time. So what do you do about it? There are a couple of ways you do it. You do an atlas exercise. So you go out there and you ignore the states, or you co-opt the states into producing a national picture, and the atlas was a remarkable success in doing that. And in some ways, and some of the things we're doing recently, we're doing a bit more of the same, but I'll come back to that. The other thing to do is to set up a collaborative program, and this is the Australian Collaborative Land Evaluation Program, or ACLEP, which many of you may have heard of. And what that has done is said, all right, there are some things we need to do here. We need to have national standards, we need to develop some agreed visions about where we need to do, and we need to move in various ways towards an Australian soil resource information system. This has been going on now for probably about 15 years. So we have a whole series of national standards, national field description standards, a soil classification system for Australia, various handbooks around soil chemical, physical standards, new guidelines for soil survey, a national site data schema, and so on. All of these are the building blocks to be able to build a soil resource information system for the country. All of those things we've done. And then we started building that over the last 5 or 6 years. And we have put all that nationally into a WebGIS mapping system. And if you go to asris.csro.au, you will see the collation of Australia's national information. It's been built by the Australian soil information community, at least the government CSIRO parts of that community. And it's a collation across our diverse information. It's collation. It's collage, if you like. To do it, we had to come up with a data schema which was bigger and better and all-inclusive of all of the data schemas that were out there. We've got 7 levels of hierarchy, from a very broad national level down to individual sites, and 5 depth layers are built in. It typically has mapped and unmapped components within a polygon. It uses the concept of there being an idealised soil which has a set of attributes that you can apply to those polygons, and then you are able to map out those polygons as those attributes of the idealised soils applied in each of them. Importantly, it has a focus on attributes. You can map pH, organic carbon, and so on, not just soil attributes, not just soil types. Now we are able to use those to display on a continental 250 metre grid those key attributes, and that's now available as an ASRIS standard product, which can be available to anyone. That in itself was a breakthrough. It took quite a bit of work to get states to agree that their information could be provided in that way nationally. If you go to the ASRIS site, you'll see the system described. It will tell you that it forms in those sorts of shapes, those levels, those depths. And you'll be able to zoom in and have a look at particular parts of the country. And it's pleasant to be able to give this talk in South Australia rather than, say, New South Wales, where ASRIS looks particularly good in this part of the world because of particularly the very constructive work that David Mashmed, who you saw in the earlier photo, put into this. In some ways, zooming in on South Australia is a trivial use of ASRIS because South Australian information you can get locally. Where ASRIS becomes important is where we start to look beyond boundaries. So this was an exercise that we did as part of a broader exercise to look at the potential for replacing the lost agricultural productivity over the Murray-Darling Basin with an increased agricultural productivity in northern Australia. This was a land suitability analysis work done by CSIRO in the 3 northern states, territories. And it's an illustration of both the strengths and weaknesses of this approach. One, we could do it, and we did it in a rigorous, agreed method. 2, it shows you things like very interesting collections of state boundaries or project boundaries and so on, which are our inheritance and which are the results of something which you build out of a collage. Now I'd like to talk, so this is our legacy. This is doing soil information as it was done after the war and during that period up until the end of Keith's career. And that was built on and our ASRIS then is built on this data and a method legacy. So we have these conventional soil maps, they're all polygonal. There's a wide variation in scale and size of these polygons. They almost always contain dominant and subdominant soil types, not mapped. The soil types themselves are a classification based on an identification of one or more modal or idealised soil profiles. We then typically attach attributes to those measured profiles and then spread them through the landscape by making the assumption that soil attributes co-vary with each other and with the soil classification. Now, if you assume that soil and land characteristics are mostly interdependent, are correlated, observably patterned, land use is constrained by an interaction of several attributes which come together in a soil type, then a mappable unit is possible and effective. And this was the breakthrough in soil survey that occurred after the Second World War. Air photo interpretation made some of this possible. So, for example, this is an area of Western Australia from ASRIS, I think. They are the raw polygons. There is attributes attached to those, and then becomes possible to map out clay content, water capacity, organic carbon, pH. Through ASRIS, you can do that for the whole of the country. If you look carefully, though, you'll see that there is only one option, one colour available for a polygon, because there is no way of looking within polygons. We were able to do this because of the revolution that air photo interpretation allowed us. It allowed us to use Yenny's factors of soil, the drivers of soil distribution, factors of soil formation. In using air photo interpretation, we're able to capture many of those factors: the terrain, the vegetation, the reflectance patterns, and coupled with purposive sampling, the beginnings of pedo transfer functions, we were able to do the sorts of mapping that we were talking about. So it produced a complete and complex paradigm, and those of us who got involved in it, we spoke our own languages, we came together and enjoyed ourselves immensely, but many people outside the community were confused and didn't understand some of the complexities and the compromises that are involved in doing that. But it was an extremely efficient way to do it compared with what was available for air photo interpretations. There was one alternative available in those days, and it was the birth of geostatistics, and that created some very interesting different views and some very interesting and hard-fought battles. So much of our legacy, and what's the data that's in ASRIS, comes from that way of looking at the world, and it represents decades of investments. It's got significant limitations. Unfortunately, the classifications do work some ways, but they have limited capacity to carry the full load. Things like pH, soil, carbon, wind and water erosion, the things that we have always been interested in and are increasingly interested in, are often driven by different processes than drove the classification of the soil. It's also a 3D problem. We always struggle with really getting the proper inference about subsoil processes from what we're observing. And many of these important soil processes we're interested in take a long time to develop. The rate of change is not necessarily the same for any two processes, so the inference process again is challenged. And the high short-range spatial variability was always a challenge for us to measure and to talk about. The most recent response to this has been, in some ways, a merging of that view of the world with the geostatistical view of the world and a few other views of the world. These days we call this digital soil mapping, or DSM. We needed to retain the richness that we had developed in those decades, but fixing many of these limitations. We're moved beyond geostatistics to include data mining, data logic approaches. We'll talk about some of these. Importantly, there's been a sensing explosion. We now have at our hands geophysics, proximal soil sensing, time series remote sensing, which was not available to us before. It replaced air photo interpretation with a much more powerful toolkit. The other thing that's been on our side is Moore's Law. So things that we would always imagine we could do, but were never able computationally to do, we've started to be able to do, and the computing power really is growing faster now than our imagination seems to, in some ways. Coupled with that is the development and use of digital elevation at a very fine scale, and particularly digital elevation models which become available through satellite remote sensing, and the development of inference systems, the maturing, if you like, of the pedo transfer process. Then Jenny's factors, which used to be called CORPT or CLORPT, becomes SCORPAN. And the important difference is that we add the geographic position which is built into this process. The other difference is we're no longer talking about the factors of soil formation. With that, what we're talking about is a way to, or a process for developing empirical relationships between what we observe and our covariates so that we can generalise those across the landscape. Now, this is how soil survey is done in this country, in a general sense. In a general sense, because there are a couple of exceptions. Two, there's hardly any survey done, but we'll get back to that. I'll move on. In fact, I'll talk about it this way. Currently, we're doing a couple of major digital soil mapping exercises in Queensland. And farmers have been out there and observed that we are sampling the landscape beyond soils that they consider to be interesting and wanted to know why we were doing it. So we put together a few slides which tried to explain what digital soil mapping was and how it worked. And essentially this is the process that we used. What it does is it puts together the pieces of evidence around the soil forming factors in the best evidence that we can put our hands on in that part of the world, and use statistical techniques to fill in between those samples. And what's the evidence? The evidence is high quality image of the terrain, 30-metre terrain patterns that we have in that now across the whole of the country. Soil and rock patterns, which comes from gamma radiometrics, airborne geophysics method from the top 50 centimetres of the soil. Land use and land cover, which come from time series remote sensing. Climate from the Bureau of Meteorology and CSIRO. And importantly, existing soil sampling and soil maps. What we then do when we do this process is, in many ways, analogous to what happened with air photo interpretation, is to find out, but this way in an observable and rigorous and empirical way, what is the relationship between what we observe and the tools and clues that we have about the soil forming factors. So you end up developing these relationships, and that typically means in most places in the country is that we have a set of existing samples. We then need to have a set of new samples which we place in the landscape to improve the power of our predictive process. One of the interesting things that came out of this as well was that the surveyors that are working in this process were producing, in the end, so that they could communicate with each other, the same landscape drawings, in a general sense, that Northcote produced at the time when he did the soil atlas, to ensure that we were capturing the important processes that are operating across that landscape. Digital soil mapping produces a different sort of outcome. It produces, it focuses on the individual qualities of the soils and landscapes, rather than trying to make a classification fit the landscape. They're quantitative, it's fast and flexible, we can do it faster than we were able to do it in the past. It is designed to work with modelling, and it allows testing and refinement. We can work out how well we know the landscape, we can go back and improve on that. And the other thing that's interesting about it is that it produces a shading of the landscape which is more intuitively correct. So typical soil mapping produces homogeneous blocks of country with lines in between, the isopleth map. And when we first did digital soil mapping now over about 15 years ago, and we were worried what farmers would think about a soil map which was shaded and continuous rather than had lines on it. The farmers said, yeah, well, that's what the world's like. We understand that. The people who didn't like it were the planners. The planners want black lines so that they can stop a plan at one point and move on to another. We have active programs now going using these approaches in Queensland and Tasmania, and in the Philippines, and this is the basis of a planned new investment in national soil data collection. So we have ASRIS, we have these new approaches to collecting new information. We still have some major problems with the national soil information. So digital soil mapping can produce the sorts of attributes that we want, and in some ways it comes close to our desired state of soil information. But it's only just starting. The great bulk of our information is the information that is in the ASRIS, and it's pre-digital soil mapping. So we have been working on for the last 5 years, and particularly at the moment, on developing a new view of national soil information, which we call the Australian Soil and Landscape Grid, and it has been developed with people from around the world as part of what's called the Global Soil Map. Same sorts of approaches. we spoke recently to a number of people in Canberra about what do we need of a soil carbon map? And the agreement was, well, we don't really need so much a soil carbon map. Really, we need spatial and temporal systems focused on carbon. And to do that, it actually have to have a nationally consistent data set of measurements. It's got to be able to get spatial and temporal variation from the system, mapping and the monitoring. You need to be able to measure the stocks and the fractions. It has to be at a fine spatial resolution. It's got to have all of the depths that are important. It's got to be able to run simulation models so you can explore scenarios, evaluate options. And it's got to be a piece of infrastructure that's current and updatable. You can fix it up. It also has to have measures of uncertainty so that you know how well you know what you don't know. And it has to work across scales. Now, when you've got that, you can update it, you can improve it, you can forecast, you can test, you can choose, you can advise people. All of the things that now we need to do around carbon in this country. But carbon is just an example. We also need to do this for nutrients, land degradation, food production. All of that is beyond our current soil information system, beyond ASRIS. But we think we can get there with a combination of the legacy collation and the digital soil mapping approach, and this is why we're developing what's called the Australian Soil and Landscape Grid. It's, if you like, a piece of infrastructure, and that's how it's been sold to the Australian government, which is currently funding this as a piece of national infrastructure to provide the information which fits into the description that I had for the soil carbon information that we need for the country. So the specification looks like that. We are interested in those key soil properties. We need to know those soil properties in those depths. We need to, at least those properties, and from those properties we need to have built into this system the capacity to predict a whole range of model parameters using an embedded inference system. In some way, that is an encapsulation of what the system's about. The other thing that we're building with it is a new set of landscape descriptors. So using the shuttle radar digital elevation model, we now have approximately 30 metre elevation data around the country, which includes things like a whole new set of wetness indices, and an experimental attempt at getting Spate's landform description coming out of this process, which seems to be working reasonably well. There's a number of things that we need to do this, and I won't go through this very long, but to run this system we actually need to build the information framework, and we need to do this in such a way that this system pulls from the South Australian system, the Western Australian system, a private laboratory who wants to sign up to it, information in real time. We don't want to be doing this exercise as a collation exercise. We want to do this as an established, interconnected information system for the country. We need to get better covariates. We need to do some disaggregation of our existing polygonal mapping, and I'll show you what we're doing there shortly. We are developing ways of understanding how depth relationships can be captured and used, and to use this we're using a mass preserving spline which is working extremely well for that purpose. We're producing a new process for estimating and testing uncertainty, embedding a soil inference system into this, and developing access processes. There's a whole range of activities then that need to happen to do this. One of them is, for the first time, every state in the country has signed up to allow all of the site data in all of their data sets to become available for the system. We've never been able to do that before because they can see the benefit in it. Now these soil data are not every one of those soil data are as useful as the others. This is pH, the soil data that have pH in them. These are the ones that have organic carbon. If I showed you the one that had bulk density in it, you'd hardly see it at all. And I just thought I'd show you Keith Northcote's sites, which happen to be also collated in there. I think there's about 95 of them. An interesting concentration in the Barossa, I noticed. As well as that, we are hungry for information of all sorts. So the Soil Carbon Research Program has produced a particularly valuable set of soil descriptions, soil samples and soil analyses which will feed into this. There's an AusPlots program as part of TURN run out of the University of Adelaide here, which will feed into this program. Information collected by Geoscience Australia will go into this as well. We want to get as many points of truth, observations of what's happening on the ground into the system as we can. We'll just move on. The University of Sydney has been working for some time on the development of more powerful inference systems. That's been built and is working. We now want to build this into this system. So we're moving from, and we're developing this as an inference system that works with all of those data across the whole of the country. The early parts of that are producing mineralogy maps of the country that we haven't had before. And we're able to do this down right at the landscape scale. The ambition for this project is to have an estimate at every point, every 100-metre point in the country. So, just to finish on the discussion on this, the first part of this disaggregation process that we're doing is happening in the Burdekin catchment in Queensland. So this is a very large chunk of country. What we've done here is that we have existing polygonal mapping. We have all of the covariates that I've been talking about, the geophysical data, the terrain data. We have all of the sites that we can get. What we've been doing is running an iterative inference process to place the soil attributes we're interested in within the polygons in the area, and then do that for each of the depths that we're interested in. So this is version 0.1 of the disaggregation process, which needs to happen all around the country. But it's a start. So as you see, as we go down, pH changes in that part of the world. The other reason for putting this in is the people that have worked on this. Two state agency people, CSIRO and the University of Sydney are working collaboratively on doing this work. We're doing the same thing in Western Australia and New South Wales at the moment, testing some of these concepts. Why are we... A little bit of a diversion for a moment, I suppose. So imagine now that we end up with a national system which is 100-metre resolution, covers the entire country, has an estimate for all of the functions that we need to know about our soils with an uncertainty estimate around it. It's available everywhere in the country. Then what does that allow us to do that we can't currently do? Well, one of the things it does is allow us to look in more depth at some of our really important issues. So in the Sustainable Agriculture flagship, we're interested in the question of the sustainability of agricultural productivity. So Australian farmers are probably the most productive businesses historically in the country. They've grown at about 2.1, 2.2% per year since about 1950. Concern is that probably for the last few years they're growing at about 1.1, 1.2. We're not sure if that's true because the millennium drought has made that a very noisy time to try and work out what's going on. But if you look around the world, the same decline seems to be happening in many places in our major food crops. So we need to understand what's going on with our agricultural productivity. Is this happening because of a shortfall in innovation, in R&D? Is it a land degradation signal that's coming through? Is it a change in demographics? What are the sorts of things that are driving this system? Now we've got tools to do this at points in space using simulation modelling, using econometrics and all the rest of it. Again, we need this generality. We need to be able to look at this across the whole of the farming system. To do that, we need to have, and we've got, time series remote sensing, which enables us to look at changes in net primary productivity over very large swathes of the country. But until we have the soil information system that I've been talking about, we can't really start to understand how this whole system, whole production system operates. And this applies to most of the questions that we really need to ask, and which is another reason why an argument to improve our soil information is starting to gain traction. So I talked at the start of the talk about these changes in emphases, and the questions are the same, but the emphasis has changed. The importance has grown. There is no doubt about the importance of soil information for the problems of the world. It's generally agreed, but in Australia, we effectively have no current programs of collecting it, except at the sorts of one-off single-issue type activities that are abounding at the moment. So I'm not going to say much more than this because I don't like to do doom and gloom talks. So this is my doom and gloom slide. That graph is a map of that soil map that I showed you, all the sites in the country. That's when they were collected. So they started in about 1940, 41, 46, and they've stopped essentially in 2011. Now, it's not quite true, but then there is a little bit continuing on, but it's very low. We've stopped before we finished. There is some hope, and there is the development of a new soils RD&E strategy, and some of us have been involved in some of the meetings associated with that. One of the intentions is to move towards a national cooperative soil survey, and I've heard of them before somewhere, Rob. To finish, back to colour. One of the important aspects of the factual key is the recognition that soil colour is easily seen and therefore eminently keyable, which is why you would include that in a key, but they are also important in terms of soil functions. It tells you quite a bit about soil function. And many of us have cut our teeth in the early days in looking at soil colour, trying to work out what that meant. We have expanded our palette, if you like. So we now look at soil colour using a whole range of influence. We look beyond the visual to the infrared and beyond, and we look from near and we look from afar. So this is a colour map of Australia, the spectrum of Australia, used using the near infrared imagery from the samples in the Australian Archive spread across the country. It's a very beautiful thing, and it's not much more than that until you start feeding it through ways to derive inference from the various ways in which we can look at the colour of soils, the reflectance of soils. More importantly, we've only just started to touch what we can do with things like remote sensing, which in many ways for soils is rather bizarre. It's been around for a long time. Landsat's been around since the late 70s. We're still learning how to use it. We are now, though, have available to us hyperspectral information. That's the ASTRA imagery. That's only just been finished. That actually gives us an image of of individual minerals on the surface of the soil. We haven't yet built that into our systems, but we will. Gamma radiometrics geophysical data for the country is improving rapidly all of the time, and it is our most useful way of looking at these colours that come in the country. And here we're talking, of course, about a much broader part of the electromagnetic spectrum. And the other thing that we're starting to do is we're getting not only this increase in... There are two things that are happening in remote sensing that we're starting to use in soils, just starting to use in soils. One is the substantial increase in frequency, so the use of time series data, which confers great power when used with high-powered computing. And the other is the substantial increase in resolution, which is now starting to appear, so that we can look at individual trees in paddocks rather than individual gilgai formations. And now we are increasingly seeing new constellations of radar satellites, hyperspectral satellites, which are going to come on stream in the next little while. Mix that with what you can do on the ground with your what we call the Earth rover and what we call the echidna, so two of our proximal sensing tools, which people get terribly excited about, goes into the mix of allowing us to, once we build this system, to improve it and to use it as a monitoring tool. Now everybody's excited by apps now. We've just produced the soil app, the soil map app. We're actually going to rename that. Nobody's happy with the name. But anyway, soil map is what it's called for the moment. It's available. We hope that we can get it through the iTunes system so that we can release it at the National Workshop, the National Conference. What it does is it pulls important information which has been collected through ASRIS, through digital soil mapping, through this new soil and terrain system for the country. And the information that we have currently in the system to allow us to run simulation models. It's available. Farmers are actually using it and are excited about it, who would never have used our information before. But there's no sense in really having that until we get the information underneath. So that's essentially what this pathway's been about. The delivery has become, in many ways, the drivers for substantially improving the system that we use. And I think what we've seen is a progression of the sorts of approaches, the imagination, the invention that Keith had is now running through our entire system. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You're happy to take a few questions? So if there's any questions?
I'm Amanda Schofel. I was just interested in looking at your depth zones that you're going to put up for 0 to 5, 5 to 15, 15 to 30. Just wondering why that's gone away from the 0 to 10 or from typical horizons or layers rather than...
Can I write on that? In fact, we're not going away from it. What we're doing is, I can't write on that. Is developing and storing in the system as a spline which will look something like that. And those depths that you saw are in fact the parameters of the spline. And then they will be served out and they'll be the standard depths, but you'll be able to interrogate that in any way. So you'll be able to ask questions like, how much carbon is there in the top 5.5 centimetres, or any sort of question that you can imagine.
I'm most concerned about that doom and gloom graph that showed about the decline in data. And I sort of thought about it, and I'm just wondering if it isn't just a question of not asking the right questions of people collecting data that could go into the system. If I can explain it in a different way. We've just completed the acid sulfate soil mapping in the Murray-Darling Basin. Seriously, we have got hundreds of thousands of data. Now, fortunately, we're in a stage at the moment where we're trying to capture that data into some system that we could give over to ASRIS or whoever. Okay, so and there isn't really a very clear mechanism in terms of being able to give that data across. In this instance, yes, we have a connection to ASRIS, but even then, it's not that easy to be able to give that across to you people for you to use, not so much in the acid sulfate soil map, but
more generally.
Okay. So, is there any way that somehow that not only our group or people working in that area, but I'm thinking in terms
Yep.
of maybe industry that are collecting pHs for soil fertility work and that sort of thing, could get that data to you.
Yeah, look, I think there are two issues there, Rob. Well, there are at least two issues. There are more issues than that. I agree with you, and putting up a graph of what were essentially the state and CSIRO survey points
Right.
is an inadequate picture of the activity around the country. It is still a powerful picture. So the sorts of things that you're talking about would just be another layer on the top of it. It is true that in many of the states in the country there's virtually no activity happening. So just put that to one side. The point that you raised, though, there is your group, there is of a whole slew of consultants of various sorts, many of them these days well trained, of private companies, mining companies and so on, utility companies. There are university collections of data which are not making their way into this collaborative, cooperative space. And it is actually something that they have on the agenda as part of the Soils RD&E task force to get our way around that. In some ways, the things that you run up against are the simplest problems. They just you've run up against a lack of time and a lack of willingness to write a little bit more code to get the thing in. Many of the other issues become more complicated. They're about licensing and ownership and privacy and display. Again, all of which are worth working our way through to fix them up. So we know that there are hugely valuable information out there which will improve our national picture, and we're determined that we're going to get them.
Dean?
Just interested in the uncertainty of any of the attributes that
Yeah.
are being either predicted or measured. It comes to both differences in methods and also the prediction models being used. I think you just mentioned on Sinfla as well, being from Sydney University. But using those in any predictive model on landscape use, the error in what you're modelling, capturing the error in the uncertainty and propagating that, because then you have compounded errors where you may end up with 1,000% variance in your prediction. Where's the usefulness in that prediction, I suppose, where you have a warning saying, hang on, you go.
Again, there's a number of ways of answering that. There was always a substantial amount of uncertainty on any comment we made about a particular map or a particular attribute in the past. We just never put a value on it. Well, sometimes, rarely we did. Usually we didn't put a value on it. So there was no sort of warning signal coming through. The ways in which you use it, and we are still, this is an active area of research that is coming into this process. It may be that we talk about the relative certainty of things existing within a band, and then you use that band going through. We have done some work, a few years old now, looking at some SEDNet modelling, which is a distributed form of USLE modelling across a catchment. And there are a whole range of errors associated with all of those. But when you actually looked at it, the errors don't necessarily compound. They, depending on the situation, they can actually coalesce and work together. So it's not simply the case that you'll always end up with such huge errors that you won't be able to say anything useful. It's a good question, and we're exploring our way through it.
Question really is, I think there's been an impressive amount of organisational data. The data can now be organised very, very well, and lots of data can be organised. The question really is, are we collecting the right data? It looks to me like the data we've got available to organise is traditional data, and that's good. But I once heard a British soil scientist, a very eminent British soil scientist,
Was that Richard Webster?
Sorry?
Was it Richard Webster?
No, it wasn't Richard Webster. It was a guy called
Yeah.
Peter Nye. He was a very
I know. I worked with Peter Nye.
Yeah,
A very long time ago. Look, the short answer is yes. Now, so these digital soil mapping exercises collect the right data. We measure, whereas in the past we used to collect for every measured site where we put it through a laboratory somewhere, there'd be something like 10 or 50 morphological sites, and we would in some way. Now we measure each of the sites and we measure them for the parameters which enable us to say whether this plant will grow on that soil. Yes, digital soil mapping does that. The problem is most of our legacy data is not like that. So we have to collect more of the data that we really need, absolutely, but we also have to make great use of the 5 decades of data that we've got. And both of those things are possible. Oh, and one of the other things that we can do, the really important thing is archives, and we've started to realise how important archives are. So the National Soil Archive, CSIRO Soil Archive, has now become part of the National Collections, and we want to raise its status because you can go back and remeasure these things with new techniques, and we're doing a lot of that at the moment.
Hi, Amazon from Soil Group, and I got a scope to ask question following job. I work with soil strength and root penetration. I think it's a very important area to explore the subsoil especially. And I didn't see any scope to put that soil quality index or whatever using that type of parameters, like soil strength in different landscapes.
Yeah, look, some of the soil physical characteristics are tricky. The intention in a digital soil mapping exercise, you would measure as many of those as you could. It'd be part of the exercise that you did. In terms of going back into this Australian soil landscape grid type activity, we have not specified that or those physical characteristics as part of the specifications, because we know, that map I put up of the sites around the country, how many had pH, how many had organic carbon, bulk density would be very small, penetrometer resistance and the B horizon would be very, very small. So we don't have many data to work with. So then you come back and you rely on pedotransfer functions to try and get to that from exchangeable sodium percentage, clay content, and so on. But again, we have very few data to develop decent pedotransfer functions. So there are challenges, and that's probably some of them.
Any more questions? If not, I'd like to thank Mark for a really interesting talk, and I'd like to join you.
I'd just like to present you with this as well as a small memento for your office. I'm sure you can find a space on your wall for it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Annie.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. That was fascinating for me as a soil biologist. Very interesting to see what's going on in a completely different. And I believe there's probably not much soil biology information at all underpinning some of that, perhaps apart from organic carbon, maybe.
There's a dot for everything, but very few dots.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And so, lastly, I'd like to come to the C.G. Stevens Award for 2012. I'm afraid I was remiss in not actually putting my slide up about C.G. Stevens. I don't have it with me to talk about him, but some of you can tell us perhaps in the break afterwards about him. It would be nice to hear a little bit about him. He obviously was very active here in South Australia, but one of his legacies is an award in the Society that is given to the best PhD thesis in soil science around the country each year. And this year's award has been given to Raj Setia. He's a postdoctoral researcher now with Associate Professor Petra Marshner in the Soils Group here at Waite, and is for a thesis entitled modelling organic carbon turnover in salt-affected soils. And I'd just like to read something that the committee sent me, because there is a committee of soil scientists around the country that look at these theses and judge them. And they said the unanimous recommendation of the awards committee was that Dr. Raj Kumar Setia be awarded the C.G. Stevens Award for the best PhD in soil science for 2012. The thesis is of high impact with impressive breadth and diversity, including work in 2 countries and several published journal articles that have already come out of the work. It identified the impact that soil salinity has on carbon fluxes in soils in both irrigated and dryland situations. The findings have impacts for both the Rothsea carbon model and for soil carbon accounting. The committee note that all the theses submitted for the award were well written and of very good quality, many with several journal article publications or prepared manuscripts. They were all assessed according to their originality, significance to soil science and clarity of writing. A final decision was made on the basis of the significance to soil science of Raj's thesis. And we wish to congratulate Dr. Raj Kumar Setia and all who applied for the award for the very high standard and scope of their work. It was a difficult decision in 2012. So against high competition, I'd like to say, Raj, well done. I'd like to I'd like to just give you this little interim PVC award, but there is a very fancy award with a C.G. Stevens medal, which unfortunately Raj won't be able to receive at the conference because he's not going to be there, but maybe you could nominate somebody to receive it on your behalf. Congratulations. Thank you, everybody. And I'd just like to make a small announcement that our next function will be on the 20th of November. Do you remember what day that is? I can't remember. It's Tuesday the 20th. I asked my committee, I've got much better memories than I have. And that's going to be our AGM for the year as well, quite early before the main conference. And it's going to be a student presentation night, so we've funded some students, partly funded them to go to the conference in Hobart, and they will be talking to us about what they're going to present. They're relatively short talks. We will also be presenting the third and final round of the Jane Gillooly Memorial Award. We have 2 winners this year, so that will be then, and there's a third thing we'll be doing. We'll be having the AGM, so there'll be plenty going on. So I encourage you all to ask other members to come along that you know and to come along yourself. And now I think there are some drinks and nibbles outside this arena afterwards. I believe we have a select group of us going for dinner later on with Mike, which will be very enjoyable.
Do you want me to say a little bit about C.G.
If
Stevens?
you know something, Richard, that would be great, because I do have a little PowerPoint, but I haven't got it with me.
He's actually written his work history. He exists in the CSIRO library. I don't know a lot about him, but I've met him quite a few times and have a little bit in common with him. He was born in Tasmania, and he went to the same high school that I was in high school. So we used to have little chats about Tasmania. But he, I think, was probably employed as a soil chemist initially, based in Tasmania, where there was a CSIRO group at Battery Point. He was engaged in doing some soil chemistry stuff, and there are photos of him working in the lab, but he got interested in soils in the field and did a number of soil surveys in Tasmania. Some of them, J.K. Taylor was the chief of soils division at the time, and he did some soil surveys, I believe, that J.K. Taylor didn't initially know about, but was quite impressed with. And Stevens got drawn into the pedological and soil surveys side of things, and was shifted to South Australia. I'm not sure when that was, but he was active in working in surveys of the Murray, and he worked for Soils Division. Was he sort of head pedologist after Taylor, I suppose, was he?